Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second day of this free online two-day conference called Truth, Dissent, and the Legacy of Daniel Ellsberg. I'm Chris Appy. I teach in the history department at the University of Massachusetts, and I'm joined by my colleague and co-moderator, Kathy Roberts Forde from the journalism department. The intent of the conference, obviously, is to commemorate Daniel Ellsberg's release of the Pentagon Papers 50 years ago. But we also, we don't want to focus exclusively on that because his life encompassed many important issues. So we want to address some of those. And so this morning's panel focuses on the anti-war movements of the Vietnam era and today. It's important for us to remember that Ellsberg's act of whistleblowing was done in a much larger context of the largest, most diverse and vibrant anti-war movement in U.S. history. So he was exceptional in many ways of being a person of such high rank who took such personal risk to try to end the war, but many thousands of other Americans took great personal risks as well. And we know that Ellsberg had great support from the anti-war movement and took great inspiration from it. So I will turn it over now to my colleague, Kathy Forde.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you all for being here. We're really looking forward to hearing from our panelists today. It's a rather large group, so in just a moment you'll be meeting them, and they'll be introducing themselves. We'll get going now.
He, her, hers here in Durham, North Carolina. Part of the War Resisters League. And I have to tell you, my beginnings began in December 1967 at the Oakland Induction Center. The War Resisters League West and the Institute for the Study of Nonviolence were committing acts of nonviolent disobedience 54 years ago. And while I was in jail, the only Black woman going to jail at Santa Rita, a wonderful woman came over to me, Jane Shulman, and said, "Mandy Carter, have you heard about the War Resisters League?" I kind of have. Well, we'd like to invite you to a potluck. That potluck led to my getting hired in 1969. And one of the staff people besides Jane Shulman was Randy Kehler. So I'll pass it on to Randy.
Randy, would you like to introduce yourself and perhaps share a moment from your life that inspired you to become...
I'm not getting any sound.
All right. Pass it on to Susan.
Good morning. I'm Susan Schnall. I was in the United States Navy from 1967 to 1969. I think my moment of having to take an action occurred during my duty and on taking care of the active duty sailors and Marines who came back from the war zone in Southeast Asia. And it was an understanding that I could both be a healer and be a member of the United States military. And it was at that moment of having seen the injured and hearing their stories that I decided I had to do something. And I think the rest of the story is just, I don't want to take too much time, but it was having a friend who was deciding to drop anti-war leaflets on military installations in the San Francisco Bay Area, because I felt that there were so many who were in uniform, who were against the American war in Vietnam, and that we needed to be heard. And I'll pass this on to Wayne Smith, who was in Vietnam.
Good morning. Yes, I was indeed. Wayne Smith. I'm born and raised in Providence, Rhode Island, in a racially integrated community. And I had the very good fortune to have a loving family that, in effect, supported whatever we chose to do in life. My sister was part of the anti-war movement, my older sister, very early. And I was non-committal. I wasn't pro-war, but I expected that one day I might go, either by drafted or being volunteering. I chose to volunteer as a medic. I wanted to make a contribution. And I must also say that the great influences of my life and my family was part of the civil rights movement, how to advance the cause of equality and and justice for African Americans. So that was much more in my consciousness. But having said that, I served 18 months in Vietnam as a combat medic. One of the greatest blessings I had was to work with the Vietnamese people, providing medical assistance. And since the war, I have tried to both make sense of myself, the world, and to deal with causes and consequences of war. Thanks.
Danny Sjursen, would you like to go?
Yes. Well, thanks for having me. This is really great and an honor to be part of this. I'm Danny Sjursen. I'm sort of an accidental soldier who became an accidental anti-war activist to the extent that I try to be. Not a typical voice in this sense. I went to West Point. I was in the Army almost too long. I did Iraq and Afghanistan, 18 total years. I think that, in terms of a single story, it's always very difficult because there are rarely pivotal moments that just make everything turn. But I will say that, I was against the war in Iraq from my first patrol. And on my first patrol, I responded to a sectarian murder as part of the civil war that we started and was hit with an IED on the way back. And I think that the best way to describe my journey is sort of the difference or the gap between what we were told we were doing and what was actually happening. And I think that, like so many others who've been more courageous than me, that gap, not speaking publicly about it, felt obscene. And so I'm just honored to be with this group because the legacy of this goes way further back than my generation. There's a lot of differences and similarities, and I think we should talk about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. And Nguyet Nguyen is also here. She is a historian of anti-war movements.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. I'm really honored. I was born and raised in Vietnam by the Gulf of Tonkin. I was not in the anti-war movement. I hope you can see that. But I am a student of the anti-war movement. More specifically, I study the role of the Vietnamese in the anti-war, the global anti-war movement. So I focus on the Vietnamese in Vietnam and in the US and in France.
Thank you. And Randy Kehler is with us today as well. Randy, can you introduce yourself?
We may still be having technical difficulties with him. So maybe we could go back to Mandy.
I'm Randy Kehler, and
Okay.
Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Yes.
We can hear you, Randy.
Where's the volume again?
Just speak. Yeah.
Click up here. Oh, good. Oh, you can hear me now?
Yes.
We can.
Well, I'll just quickly, I was in college during the beginning of the Vietnam War. You can hear me?
Yes.
And I didn't pay much attention to it, but I had the opportunity to go over to work for 15 months in a refugee camp in East Africa during my college years. And it was opened my eyes to the way the majority of the world lives. And I came back, and then I was totally incensed by the war in Vietnam and decided I couldn't cooperate with it. And the long and short of it is, I graduated from college, went to graduate school, dropped out of college, graduate school to work in the anti-war movement in 1960s in San Francisco, where I met Mandy, and I ended up going to prison for 2 years for draft non-cooperation.
Mandy, you actually met Randy at an office.
That's what got me started.
Resistors League. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your relationship with Randy and what brought the two of you together there and the kind of work you were doing.
Well, I have to do a little bit of a backup. I was actually born in 1948. So for all those post-World War II baby boomers, Chris, I was really thinking about, and Susan, you can relate to this as well. we're thinking about living in two orphanages and a foster home in upstate New York, Albany, New York, Schenectady, New York, and a Black foster family in Chatham Center. But because I was born in 48, I remember these 4 distinct years that I think is interesting with this conversation moving forward. Cuban Missile Crisis, remember those air raid signs going off and duck and cover and run home. November 22nd, 63, Kennedy assassinated in Dallas. April 4th, 1968, Kennedy assassinated in Memphis while he started the beginning of the Poor People's Campaign. And then June 12th, during the Poor People's Campaign, 1960, Bobby Kennedy, urban legend, KKK. But you age out of the system at 18. And because our social studies teacher at Mount Pleasant High School, Jack Hickey, thank you for social studies teacher, brought in this young white staffer from an organization I never heard of before, the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers. 3 things that said that day while I'm here with you today at the age of 72. Quakers believe in basically full equality and justice for all. The second thing, Chris, was this idea of the power of one, that each of us has the ability to impact change. It didn't make any sense then, but it was the third thing. We have a high school work camp in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania. Who would like to go? I went. And that was the first time ever I heard the name Bayard Rustin, certainly Black gay guy who helped organize the march, Audre Lorde. But there was this white couple from the Highlander Center in Tennessee. The Highlander Center started in 1932 intentionally to bring Black and white folk together to talk about social justice, but they called themselves culture workers, Guy and Candy Carowin. And what they were doing as white allies in the civil rights movement at the time was traveling into Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, recording freedom songs and this freedom meetings. And one of the groups was the Freedom Singers, who had Bernice Johnson Reagan, Sweet Honey in the Rock. But I was so impressed about white allies helping what was happening in the civil rights movement. But I think for me, in terms of just a pivotal moment, had to have been April 4th, 67, when King gave that amazing speech at the Riverside Church. What was I, 12 when the march happened in 1963? But to have that speech talked about Vietnam, he got a lot of pushback from the civil rights movement. But I remember one comment he said, how can you send Black men 8,000 miles away to kill or be killed in the name of democracy when they didn't have it when they left, and they sure the heck didn't have it when they got back? And grounding in that. And that's no disrespect for those who served. But I think when we heard that, that's my generation. And so after hearing that speech, ending up hitchhiking it to California, going to the Haight-Ashbury switchboard, hearing about Vincent O'Connor, who took us in, and then we went down to the Institute for the Study of Nonviolence, who was planning what? The December 67 CD actions at the Oakland Induction Center. And the only reason why I got a job at the War Resisters League in 1969, they said, well, we need someone. Randy was going off to jail, if you remember, Randy. And I said, I'll be willing to come and fill that slot. That was 54 years ago. And here we are. That's a powerful story. But that power of one, that's the thing I want to just stress as we do a go around. What I was so impressed about was this notion about how could one person remove their complicity with this war that was going on. And there was a thing called a call to resist for those who could not serve for whatever reason, women, older, name me, whatever it might be. We were willing to say, but I will tell people to resist that war. And I think at the time, it was called aiding and abetting. You could have got jail time. And the first person they picked on was Benjamin Spock. Big mistake. That's what we women could do. And also thinking about all those people of color serving over there, not only being killed or being killed, but also thinking about the role we would play as women and people of color to help stop that war in Vietnam. So that's the best I can give you, a little bit of recollection. But emotionally, we're still here. We are still here.
I guess I'd like to add to what Mandy said, and I think about the power of one. I was one in the United States Navy, taking care of the guys who came back, and the influence to me was being at a meeting of the Medical Committee for Human Rights and having 2 men from the Air Force in uniform come to the meeting and talk about the protest that was going to be taking place in San Francisco on October 12th of 1968. And I just thought, we can make a difference in the GI movement. The American people need to hear that not everybody in the American military supports the war in Southeast Asia. And I thought, okay, we can begin to organize. And this was at a U.S. Navy hospital, Oak Knoll Naval Hospital. So we worked together, the corpsmen, the enlisted guys, the officers, to put up posters in the middle of the night and to talk with people about United States involvement in Southeast Asia. And it was difficult to keep publicity going. So we then worked on dropping the leaflets, the flyers out of airplanes on the military bases. People heard about it, those in the military. And this was a turning point too, I think, in the GI active duty movement, where we felt that it was our responsibility to have the American people hear our views against the American war in Southeast Asia. And so at the head of the march, and this was just a turning point too, I think, in the GI anti-war movement, we were at the head of the march and were seen. There were a couple of us in uniform. We were also court-martialed for that, for wearing the uniform in a political demonstration. But it was quite extraordinary to see people gathering and to have people from my base at this demonstration and hear the powerful voices. You know, and some of the people I remember are, oh my goodness, our Green Beret guy, Donald Duncan, who got up and spoke and said he had been there. This is what he had seen. There were other very important voices. And to me, that was kind of the essence of organizing, is being with people and talking with people and having that real connection. Some of my frustration today is not being able to get together and to be that, what I call, Mandy, that old 60s organizer. I think was just so powerful. But as Mandy said, we're still here today and believe that we still have an extraordinary amount of work to do. Thank you.
Susan, that's a remarkable story. And, you know, the anti-war activism among active military personnel is one of, in my mind, the forgotten stories of that era. And it began, as you say, earlier than some people realize. Even in 67, VVAW was formed, but it didn't really become hugely active until later. I wonder, Wayne, maybe you could say a few words about the significance of Vietnam Veterans Against the War as an organization and what legacy it has today.
Thanks, Chris. I think I must say a word that even preceded VVAW, and that is arriving in country in Vietnam. And even before going, as Susan said so well, there was always a constant hum of anti-war sentiment. There was always amongst us soldiers, us men, we talked about those of us who had some level of interest and care, if you will. So there was always a hum, a discussion. There were brothers who were aware, conscious of what was happening in the war. And yet we were in this pipeline, so we were very clear about the kinds of traps we were in. But the anti-war movement, in my view, was more of a state of mind. It was one of attitude. When I arrived in Vietnam, for example, and was assigned to a combat unit, I was a platoon medic, so I was assigned to 25 men. We'd go out on search and destroy operations, and we were largely used as bait to attract so-called the enemy to expose themselves so that the war could escalate by using artillery and air support. But what I really want to mention is our platoon sergeant, Mark Roebuck. He would purposefully avoid taking us into these potential ambush areas. He would passively defy, and we would similarly defy the orders of the captain and the lieutenants. In other words, I hope your audience can appreciate, and especially those who are too young to recall or remember the experience, but the enormous divisions between where did you stand And it wasn't simply are you for war, pro war, or against war, but rather what did you stand for? And I'm pleased to say the men in my platoon, most of them, were decidedly anti-war. Not capital A, but in our actions and our consciousness and our attitudes about the Vietnamese. And of course, I must also acknowledge the great tragedy and pain that still haunts me of men who would brutalize the Vietnamese and commit atrocities. But the anti-war movement was alive and active in country. And those of us, we would talk about once we got home, how we would change the world, how we would stop the war, how we would prevent future generations from going to war, how we would never let another Vietnam happen without putting ourselves and our lives on the line. So in a nod to both Dan and so many others who bravely put themselves on the line, who exposed themselves and shared the truth of what was happening in the Vietnam War, we, I think, as a people, owe an enormous gratitude. That kind of courage, true heroism, is what was displayed. But the ordinary actions of us soldiers who made it out, many of us came back with some degree of survivor guilt, myself included, as a combat medic, and I couldn't fucking believe it. We believed that this war was doing our duty, not unlike our parents' generation, and to find the reality of the horrors of that war, we flipped, and some veterans sadly committed suicide. Others were enormously engaged in the anti-war movement. Others did humanitarian work. And that legacy continues. I'm sorry I went on a little too long. I should have had decaf.
Danny, I can't help but ask you, as a kid growing up on Staten Island, what kinds of things you heard about the Vietnam War, and more particularly the anti-war movement, growing up?
Well, it's interesting. It is very rare that Audre Lorde gets brought up, but she has a Staten Island connection that, I'm quite proud of. And I will say that what is different, I think, in my generation of veterans is that, Vietnam for my father, for that generation, was the defining decision. In other words, how someone came down on that war, whether as a veteran or as an activist or in any way, was really a defining thing. That has not necessarily been the case in my generation. So we have this very interesting situation in the post 9/11 wars, of which, I spent my life really fighting and training and now opposing, where we can have 73% of veterans who are opposed to the war in Afghanistan, but it doesn't really make a blip on the radar in the same way. And when I say that, I'm not necessarily advocating for, say, a draft, but I think it's something we have to grapple with. So the Washington Post releases the Afghanistan Papers, about a year ago, right? It was a big story. I mean, we have generals saying that we didn't know what we're doing in America's longest war, and the veterans of that war are opposed to said war. And it came and it went, and it really was the Pentagon Papers of our generation in a sense, and yet something was profoundly different. So, growing up on Staten Island as a kid, I watched Platoon when I was 7, and I learned all the wrong lessons from this art that I loved. And I thought, well, then I think I need to be a part of all that. Like the most incredible thing you can do as like a male American is to be a soldier. That I still came up in that environment despite some of this activism. And I think that's instructive in a way. It's really difficult to kind of learn the lessons from a past time and then implement them correctly. But there is something different. And I mean, maybe that will drive some conversation, but I think there's something very different about the post 9/11 wars the active duty opposition to the said wars and the way the people have responded to it. And it is very difficult to talk about that without injecting the draft, I think.
I wonder if I could just continue the discussion about the draft, because I know that there were a lot of activists who wanted to stop the draft. And I remember thinking, when that happens, we're going to lose hundreds of thousands of people. It was both the people who were drafted and their families and their friends who got out into the streets and protested the war because it hit home. It hit them. And I just, I think about that a whole lot. It's not that I think the draft should be re-implemented, but we do have a draft. We have an economic draft. So those who require an education and a job and a future join the military. It's one of, I guess, my continuing frustrations when we talk about going into high schools and organizing against going into the military. What we have to offer, and for me, that's a continuing, ongoing question. So if we don't have something to offer, what do we go in and say, this was my experience? So I would like to leave that as a question for all of us.
We will circle back to that, but I'd like to ask Nguyet, when you were growing up and going to school in Vietnam, what sort of education did you receive about the war and about anti-war activism? I'm sure you didn't hear much about anti-war activism among Southern Vietnamese there and globally, but I'm not going to put words in your mouth, so go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I grew up being indoctrinated just like any other students in any other country. There was a war going on in the US. The American imperialists came and invaded the country, and we fought bravely, and we won. And that's the first, there's no, I don't remember those things from history textbooks, because history textbooks are really boring, lots of numbers, and there's, but I learned those things, in the media, in the conversations with my family, with all the things that I saw around me, bomb craters and all the, fragmentation, and so on. Stories from my physics teachers and math teachers. But then when I went to college, that's when I was taught more systematically about the war and the international context when the war happened. And that was also where I learned about the global anti-war movement. And I was told that the Vietnamese had a big role in it, and that the Vietnamese, and so go back to what Randy said about the reason why the Afghanistan, anti-war movement, well, there's no movement against the war in Afghanistan or in Iraq, the way there was one in Vietnam. So I just thought, well, it's interesting. Maybe the Vietnamese had a small role in that, in fostering that kind of movements, not only in the U.S. but also globally. So after I came to the U.S., I was just thinking. First of all, after I came to the U.S., I realized that I didn't want to do communication. My master's degree was in communication. I thought I could not go on without understanding this war in this country, because there were too many encounters where it rubbed me wrong. I didn't know why it was wrong. It just felt really wrong. And I didn't know what to say to those people or, think about those encounters. So I thought, well, I need to understand this war. And so I just thought, well, yeah. And then in college, this is all I was taught. The Vietnamese did this, the Vietnamese did that. Well, I wanted to know how true or accurate it was, how much of it was exaggerated. So that's my story.
Wayne, when you visited our class, it was a powerful, it was one of the more powerful classroom moments I've had in my teaching career. Our students were incredibly taken with you. And so I'm asking this question on their behalf, as well as on behalf of everyone here who's listening in today. Could you talk to us just a little bit about your experiences as a combat medic in Vietnam and how the values that led you into the military in the first place really ran counter to what you experienced in the war?
Thank you. Yes. It's hard to imagine looking at me, but once I was 18 years old, and if you have a vivid imagination, I, like every 18-year-old, we felt golden. We felt we could change the world. I mean, I went to Vietnam really thinking I could save lives. I could make a difference. I could help the Vietnamese people. This wasn't noble stuff. It was what I really believed, and it was based on how I was raised and the community I came from. On the basketball team, the CYO team that I played basketball on, of the 5 starting players, 4 of us ended up in Vietnam. One guy was Irish, another was Italian, 2 African Americans. So my world view going to Vietnam and the reality of what was happening on the wall was diametrically opposed. That is to say that we were not helping the Vietnamese. And it was truly shattering in some ways because I felt so naive, so betrayed even, and yet part of the system. So in war, it was really quite amazing. The value or the measure was, are you simply going to do your duty? Are you going to do the right thing? And I never, again, it pains me to say this, but I've never been closer to men. Some of these white guys I served with had never dealt with African Americans before. Some of these African Americans had never talked to white guys or Hispanics. There was an Asian American, a beautiful brother, Kenny Pagajwan, enormously brave medic. And so this hodgepodge of Americans ended up in this shitty war that we found ourselves, if you will. And it was enormously painful because, again, to see these lovely Vietnamese people who only wanted to be, I mean, it's, again, hard for most Americans to understand, but if there was an invading army coming to our country, walking into our, we would not be hospitable. We would not be gracious. And the Vietnamese were. So that experience of seeing the Vietnamese people and understanding them, much like my mother, much like my sisters and brothers. I mean, that level of reality I was somewhat not prepared for. And I think that is true for so many veterans. But having said that, I was crushed. There was no PTSD for me. I decompensated in country. I hated the military for what we were doing. I hated our government, frankly. And I hated the American people who were largely supporting what was happening. What I have learned since that time, and I think what I tried to convey to your students, is it was really pain. And so many of us, we were really wounded by what we experienced, what we did, and what we saw others do. So the transformation of that is what, again, I have somewhat been blessed to try to do. And it's not just me. I sit with you today because one of my dearest friends is Bobby Muller, who really founded the Vietnam Veterans of America. And we did international work through his leadership to help ban landmines. We put up prosthetic clinics in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Angola. And Jack Smith was mentioned yesterday. You know, he was part of EVAW. And so many of these beautiful human beings that served in that horrible war and yet found a way to not necessarily make sense of it, but to try to learn from it. And that's what we are doing, each of us today. And I'm not speaking for you, but we are all, in a way, feeling obligated to give back especially to future generations, so they don't make these kinds of mistakes. And it's painful for me to do this. I don't like talking about it or even remembering some of this, but it is truly an obligation. And I share this audience, the stage, if you will, with some extraordinary people. And we are on, lastly, I'll just sum up by saying, I am absolutely convinced we are on the right side of history. And 50 years from now, 100 years from now, the Americans and other people will be talking about Dan Ellsberg. We'll be talking about the Pentagon Papers and talking about how we went wrong as a nation and what we can do to make it right. And I believe with every fiber of my being, what each of us are doing, trying to make a difference, is to that end. So thank you.
Like it.
I wonder if we could turn back to Randy.
Randy, yes.
And
Power of one.
Yeah, maybe Randy, as he did mention earlier, was served more than 2 years in prison for resisting the draft. And he spoke about his decision in, I think it's Swarthmore, is that right? Or Haverford, in August of 1969. And Dan Ellsberg was sitting in the back of the room. It was a moment in his life when he was becoming more curious about younger anti-war activists and wondering what he might do to help oppose the war. And Randy's speech had a huge impact on him. Randy, I wonder if you could just remember something of what you said in that speech and the impact it had on Dan Ellsberg. I think we're still having trouble with with Randy's audio, but I will just briefly tell the story myself then. Randy told a very sort of basic, straightforward story about how he had come to oppose the war and found it unjust and immoral, in part from very basic human reactions to it. Even as a college student, he one day was in the library working on some other assignment, and he just happened to notice the front page of a newspaper that had a picture of a young Vietnamese child who had been, horribly burned by napalm. And that's really, there was more to it than that, but that really flipped him. And he very shortly after that signed a resist the draft petition, putting himself, in basically waving his hand at the government and saying, "Come and get me." And in those days, it was a 5-year felony charge. Most people did a little bit less than that, but he sort of put himself in that position and told that story at Haverford. And Ellsberg was so racked with emotion, he had to leave the room. He couldn't even listen to the next speaker and went off to the men's room and talks about sobbing uncontrollably for at least a half an hour, thinking to himself that we had left to young people, the moral burden of this entire experience. Some going off to the war, like Wayne, to fight it, and others, at home resisting it and then paying the price for it. What could I do if I were willing to, risk my career and even my personal freedom to help bring the war as a somewhat older man, 40 at the time. So, he always talks about the influence and inspiration of Randy Kehler. And he sent, when Randy was in prison, he visited him and would write to him and send him a subscription to the New York Times. And on June 13th, 1971, the first day that the New York Times ran the Pentagon Papers, Randy remembers reading the paper and saying, "Oh, this is why Dan gave me the prescription. He knew this was coming." So,
I have a quick follow-up. I'm so sorry that we can't hear Randy. Because Randy went off to jail in 1969, the War Resisters League was holding its 50th anniversary conference in Asilomar, California. And one of the people who came was Daniel Ellsberg. But he was also joined by Joan Baez, and you had Stoughton Lynn and Brad Little, this incredible confluences of War Resisters dating back. But I think one of the things that I've been really struck by, there's a couple of films that I would like to make sure we can get into this little mix. But Wayne, there was a book called Bloods It was around 20 oral histories of Black vets going to Vietnam. But right now, there's a wonderful film called The Boys Who Said No, theboyswhosaidno.com, that talks about Vietnam then and where we are now, looking ahead. And a great book, I think it's called The Movement and the Madman, in terms of the positioning of the Vietnam War to where we are currently. But something I like to mention about being in jail, one of the things when we did CD, Nonviolent Civil Disobedience, in 1967, the attitude was jail, no bail. It was a combination of don't just do an action and then I get to bail out and I'm going home. No, that meant that you got to spend time in jail with other folk who had to be there. In Santa Rita in December of 1967, the bulk of the women in there were women of color, Black women. And the bulk of the people who got arrested were white women because they were opposing the war. But the most transformative moments was one of the women came over to me and said, as the only Black woman arrested, "What y'all doing in here? We're here to protest the war in Vietnam." All of a sudden it went, wait a minute now, that's my husband, that's my cousin, that's my brother, and it went on. And then we realized, and this is the part that I would love to talk about currently then and what it means now. Because when their men went before those judges, the judges gave them two options. You have an option of going to jail or you have the option of going to Vietnam. The impact of that decision that was happening across this country. So talk about that issue about what meant jail or non, but then there was a class issue. I remember at Mount Pleasant High School, if you can get a deferment because you were going to college, you found some other way not to go, who was that going to leave ultimately? And let's not forget the women who had to serve over there. I'm thinking about you, Susan. People had to serve, and some of them, when they came back, I knew them. They didn't want to talk about it. And what did that mean? And how about gays and lesbians serving in Vietnam? So we're at this interesting then, and here we are now. And I just want to leave this little interesting thing around. And you said it, Susan. It's about economic conscription. I can't tell you how many folk, because that's where you get a job, you get medical, but that's the only place you get it. But the one I want to ask now is most current. Who has gone to see that Vietnam wall? It took me 20 years of trauma to even go look at that wall in Washington, D.C. And what that means, and people I was living in the home with are on that wall, people I went to school with that were on that wall. But if we had to do a go around of anyone who's on this 2-day thing and with the Vietnam Peace Commemoration Committee, what that meant, that wall. And when people would say, now you have an option, you have choices, but at 20 years. So I'm just going to leave it there. But I'm just thinking, and I'm just so sorry we can't hear Randy, because that power of one, every day we wake up and we go about our daily lives, you have no idea who we're impacting. And that young white staffer who came to my class 50, whatever, how many years ago, if I could find them, I'm sure he just thought I'm just doing a rap. No, has not a clue the impact it had on my life and each one of us. And Susan, can I even ask you, have you seen the wall? And can you share a little bit about what that was like for you or Wayne N?
Sure. I've gone to the wall a number of times. I work with Veterans for Peace, and every Memorial Day, we write letters to names on the wall and leave the letters there. And we talk about the suffering of the people in Southeast Asia and our response to it and how it's impacted our lives. And how, my letters are an apology for not being able to stop the war sooner, for having responsibility as an American citizen for what went on during the war. I also wanted to quickly mention, I was not in Vietnam, but I did take care of the men who came back. And some of the extraordinary experiences were what happened to them, but it was also the stories of what they did to the Vietnamese people. And just hearing them and hearing it, oh my God, this is absolutely a reflection of what's going on in the American society today. That we can separate ourselves from other human beings, and don't we understand that we're all human? I had one young man who talked about going into a village and putting the Vietnamese people in a circle and saying, we had a right to kill them all because there's an enemy. So we were training people to become these kinds of human beings and murderers. And it just seemed to me, again, that was another really important point for me that said this war has to end, that I can talk about it, but we need to stop it. And And again, my patients were people who had to go and who were drafted. And today I still think it's people who have to go and feel that that's a way out of this economic downward spiral.
It looks like, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I would like to. Something came up. I was thinking the number of Americans dead in the Vietnam War, over 58,000. Yeah, it's a big number. But it's not that big a number if you compare to World War II. But for some reason, it was like the level of shame was just so astronomical. And then the anti-war sentiments were like so strong. You cite the
By the
number
way,
of
can you hear me now?
people, but I don't know if it is
Can
the
you hear me?
reason for such a strong anti-war sentiments. And so if it is not, if the number of dead people, because you had more people die in other wars, including the Korean War. So if it's not the number of dead soldiers in the war that caused it, then what caused it? And it might answer your question, Randy, about why the movements against the war in Afghanistan and Iraq did not take up. Maybe it's not because of the low death toll. It's just my comment.
If I could, I would quickly say that the Vietnam Veterans Memorial also became highly politicized, as everyone knows. The pro-war forces of Ross Perot and mostly Republicans called it the black gash of shame and attributed it to an anti-war, in effect, memorial. The brilliance of Jan Scruggs, who founded the memorial along with Sandy Furiel and so many other people, but the brilliance was it was designed to remember the American dead, and it had, and by using the names, and I was part of it from the very beginning, I must say. But the reality that many of us Vietnam veterans had who were anti-war was that the memorial would be a bit of a symbol, because it was, at the time, we understood there was an estimated 2.5 million Americans and Vietnamese, Cambodians who may have died in that war. So thinking of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial with 59,000 was only would pale in comparison to the huge numbers of Southeast Asians who died. And yet there is something that I do truly hope that the anti-war, people who are part of the anti-war movement view the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in that same way, through that lens, that it is a reflection also of the sacrifice made by anti-war demonstrators.
If I could just build on that for a second, Wayne, if the United States had lost the same number of people proportionally to our population as the Vietnamese, who lost around 3 million, the memorial in Washington would have to contain the names of some 15 to 20 million people. And keep in mind that at least half of them would be the names of children and women and older men, as say civilians, not military personnel. So there is a staggering disproportion in the level of sacrifice.
Yes.
If I could jump in really quick about this, something that has struck me over the years is the numbers can be jarring when one talks about casualties. And, about 7,000 American soldiers have been killed in Iraq and Afghanistan, Syria, but mostly Iraq and Afghanistan. I think that what's a little bit different about this time is, depending on the estimate you choose, maybe 2 million, foreigners, right? Women, children, old men have been killed as a result of the wars that America has waged in vengeance since 9/11. Counterproductive, ineffective, and yet it does not gather the same energy and steam that, say, the Vietnam War did. For all the criminality of Vietnam, I hate to nostalgize it, but at least there was a citizen pushback. And I'm on a panel right now with legends who were part of that. You know, it's not that there's not an anti-war movement now. I work with the people who are, they're all in my phone. You know, that's a problem that I know them all. I mean, there's not enough, especially in the veteran community. But I think that there's like a criminal complicity in making war an abstraction. And it is no accident, of course, that the draft goes away, that war becomes this distant endeavor right after Vietnam. And it is instructive, of course, that it's the Nixon administration that helps to do that. I mean, the Nixon administration didn't do anything to be nice, right? There was always an opportunism to it. And so I think that what strikes me is, you know, why do folks become the way that we are, if I can use the word we? You know, I was an off-putting, peculiar child. You know, my mom will always say, I didn't know how to raise this kid because all the other kids couldn't sleep at night because they thought there was monsters in their closet. He couldn't sleep at night because he read about a famine in Ethiopia. So I was a weirdo, right? But the thing is, there's a lack of citizen involvement across the board, and that's by design. That's not an indictment of the people. That's not meant as an attack. I think that what's interesting is that this has been designed to be an abstraction. I wish, what keeps me up at night is, how do we explain to the American people that, in fact, today our government is involved in a series of worldwide global campaigns that have killed millions of people to no benefit to our national security, even though, you know, I think this is, in other words, the conversation about the Vietnam War is not a 50th anniversary past. It's current, and I think that that's interesting. And I'm inspired by the fact that many of the people who are involved in this, who are with me in like trying to call this out, come from that legacy of Vietnam anti-war activism. And I think that those connections are not talked about enough, and it fascinates me to even describe it.
Could I follow up with you on that, Danny, just a bit? Because you mentioned you went to West Point and you rose to the rank of major. What was it like talking to fellow officers about these two wars that you fought in, and many of them undoubtedly fought alongside you? And is there a difference between the way the officers would talk about it and enlisted men?
You know, there definitely was a difference. I think in my first book, I was poking at my fellow officers. You know, I tell a vignette about how, for the officers that particularly the ones that I went to West Point with, who were in my unit as lieutenants, you know, they would talk about trading stocks. They would talk about the headhunters that were going to give them a job afterwards. We started getting emails from like corporate headhunter organizations before we graduated, right? Like 5 years before we can get out. Our soldiers didn't really have that option. I mean, in many cases, it was very much like an economic draft. I think what would surprise people, and I've said many times, is that the officers I served with were the perfect candidates to be pro-war. Upper middle class or above white guys from the suburbs of Houston. That's the best way to describe them. And yet, when I was in Iraq, the vast majority of my friends were skeptical of the whole thing, were really deeply upset by it, weren't as pro-war as we imagined. But what's interesting, though, is I always describe, if I took the 200 guys that I was friends with in these wars, 50% of them are apathetic about it, like fatalistic in their response, like, I can't do anything, I'm against it, but I don't want to talk about it. Maybe 40% still believe in it, 9/11 and Muslims, that's the problem. And about 10% chose to get active. And that's a small number. But I think it would surprise people to know that even the West Point officers were very skeptical of the Iraq War in 2006 and 2007. That didn't necessarily translate into a lot of public activism. There were some, obviously, but I don't think the American people are actually familiar with their own army. with the military they've crafted, that the system has created, I don't think they know their soldiers. What's definitely clear is that because mothers don't wake up, and fathers, and read the newspaper and think, oh boy, my son or daughter is going to graduate high school next year and maybe they're going to have to go to Vietnam or to Iraq or Afghanistan, it has sort of stymied the conversation. It's scuttled some of that.
Scuttled, if I may, I think it's absolutely compromised the American people. I think that, when there is an absence of so-called skin in the game, that I'm on the board of directors of, I think, the most distinguished veterans group called Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America. And they're just like us. I mean, they are. They look like the same value structure. And yet they, in many ways, not all, but many have been compromised even by that thank you for your service shit, like that is what people give. They give lip service. So the American people, and we do have to be honest, I am, as that they don't care. They really don't, because they have that, as you said so well, Danny, not only their children, I think there is almost an obscene pleasure in allowing our wars to carry on, atrocities where Americans will murder, Muslims, and then the Trump will pardon them, and there is no recourse whatsoever. So I think, again, that is what, in my view, gives greater rise to the anti-war movement and people of conscience to push back on these policies. And some of us have been trying to get, some kind of obligatory national service program, or at least to have some discussion about giving something back to the country. But I'd be very interested in hearing from my friends, particularly the leaders in the anti-war movement. What do you think about the discussion of bringing back a draft, or how do we change this dynamic?
Can I say something really quick? When Randy, you talked about the abstraction of war, turning it into an abstraction. Is it the decision of the governments now to ban showing any kind of, atrocity or, dead soldiers coming home on the screen? I think that's part of the, the way they manufacture consent.
I mean, certainly the Bush administration for a time made it so you couldn't even show the flag-draped caskets at Dover, Delaware, where we fly them in. I thought that was pretty instructive. And then they got rid of that ban, but we still don't really talk about it. It really didn't change things. And I just want to say, I think you made such a great point, sir, about the thank you for your service culture. I call it fetishizing. We have fetishized our military, and in the process, a lot of indecency becomes permissible. And it's an insult to me. And so you mentioned Edward Gallagher, who was pardoned by Trump. That's the Cali of our generation, and yet it's been handled in a very different way. And of course, My Lai and Cali was not a singular person, but it was more instructive to what the crime of the war as a whole was, like in the broader sense. And so, I'll leave with that, but I think fetishizing is the way to describe how we've handled our military. And it is a hard thing not to enjoy it. I can tell you, it is a difficult thing not to say, yes, thank me. An entire generation has had to make a decision about how we handle that. And I choose to reject it, not because I don't think some people mean thank you, but because it's a dangerous thing indeed. To fetishize a military whose ultimate purpose, in my case, was to use my radio to drop bombs on people. And that's what I did, a lot of it.
If I could just quickly add, though, Danny, that we have to acknowledge also that there were many of Gallagher's own men who testified against him. You see, so that's the thing that we also have to keep in mind, as there are so many Iraq and Afghanistan veterans who are decidedly anti-war, who are looking for ways to make sense and make amends, if you will.
But part of the problem we have a professional army.
Go ahead, Susan.
That we have this professional military that is so separate from the rest of the people. Part of it is it's become professional, and that's how the American people look at it. The other part, and I'll go back to what Danny and Wayne have said, is that, again, it's not re-implementing the draft, but it is that everybody has a part of what's going on. And when the country decides to go to war, then everybody should know what is involved in something like that. And when I think about your question in terms of the number of dead having an impact on the anti-war movement, it was the numbers of people who were impacted. It was that everybody had a brother or a father or a son that was going to be going off to war. So all of us had an emotional connection to what was going on in Southeast Asia. And I think the press also played a role. The press was there every day. You know, I worked at the hospital during the day and would go home at night and see the news and see my patients becoming patients because they were there and they were getting wounded. And it was also the stories of the people who came back were publicized. Today, it's the government, but it's also the press that has the responsibility to say, Danny, what you have seen overseas in Iraq and Afghanistan, and tell people those stories. So I feel like it's the government, it's the press, all of us are implicated. And I guess the question we have is, how do we become a people who care about others and what is going on in this country and what is going on in the world? My concern about our new technology is that it continues to separate us. I'm not one of those technical experts, but my question is, how do we get people to become more compassionate about each other and to care?
I was just going to make two quick observations. I'm really struck about how imagery had a profound impact. That picture of My Lai probably did more to change people's lives, to see old men and women and babies put in a pit and shot to death. But that young woman covered in napalm, but you go back and look at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and I just wonder, how you strike the conscience. But here's something that really gives me a lot of hope. UMass Amherst, Kathy and Chris, has a resistance studies that talks about peace studies and how you have this conversation. Why do we have a military? Jesse Helms, North Carolina, did not serve one day in his life, but he didn't mind sending all sons and daughters over to that war. And why are we having this war machine? That you could have poor people be employed by the military to have a job and education and why they're going. That's the option. But if you have peace studies, social studies, lessons learned, how do you integrate that in? Here in North Carolina, we have this thing called social justice story time for babies from 0 to 4 years old. How do you tell a 3-year-old about what it means not to believe in war? How do you tell a 4-year-old about the idea of food justice and language justice? So if you get them young, and for those of us who can't serve, and whether there's a draft or not, my question is, who's being sent off to war and to do what? Support what? And if it's about international, it's about money, it's about profit, it's exploitation, it's astounding to me. So where do we stop? How do you stop that cycle? And what gives me hope, quite honestly, I'm looking at the baby boomers, our generation. Those 18 to 35-year-olds are going to outnumber us real soon. But intergenerationally, and thinking about the lessons learned. So for those who served in it, I honor those who've lost their lives for it, dating way back from the get. But also thinking about these lands right now, and I'll just make a quick shift. If you think about what we are like now in 2021, by 2050, if not sooner, this country will be majority people of color. Keeping in mind who is already indigenous to these lands. These baby boomers, 74 million of us, and I'm looking at you, Whit, 18 to 35-year-olds are going to outnumber us real soon. That's an amazing multi-generational place to have this conversation about what we want to do moving forward and going forward. But also language justice, food justice, no hunger. I would put to you, right now we had in 1967 when King gave that speech, the Poor People's Campaign that's been going on since 1968 exists to this day. 2021, the Poor People's Campaign. That's economic justice, social justice, name me all. So if we were looking forward and thinking about where do we go, lessons from the past to go forward, it's sitting right in front of us and how we can really be a part of that. So count us in.
How about we give Randy another chance and see if he's up? Can you hear us, Randy? All right, Whit, I know you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I was gonna say I want to go follow up on that point about what to do next. I think another important thing to do, and I don't know how to do it. Maybe you have solutions to this, but I think the attitude is also very important. So you talk about the intergenerational components of it, but the new generation, we don't seem to have the same ideal. I mean, I think part of the reason why the anti-war movement in the past was so strong is because the people there were shocked. They had a certain, version about, a certain set of values and then certain expectation of the government and the view of the world. But nowadays, it seems to me that young people are, they are more cynical. They accept that the government lies. That there's nothing they can do, that they are more concerned with, immediate, needs than thinking about something larger than life. So I don't know if you agree with that or not, and do you think that if we fix that, we could move forward in a better, find more solutions to all the wars that are going on?
Mm-hmm. Can I just point to Georgia? I'm getting into electoral politics, but the reality check of what happened in that 2020 elections, when you think about Osloff and Warnock, and you think about who had to come forward. I'm here in the state of North Carolina. Jesse Helms has come and gone. We are still here. And you think about what you have to do intellectually, in terms of academically, in terms of we now, and because of COVID, that's the other interesting conversation. What we're talking about now, what was happening pre-COVID, during COVID, and what will happen post-COVID. But my optimism is really those 18 to 35-year-olds. I'm really thinking about them, but also combining with the elders, thinking about this wonderful. There's a thing called the National Council of Elders. Quick story. Remember I told you that Guy and Candy Carowin, when I was 17 years old, was at that high school work camp? Well, Kai has passed, but Candy Carowin and I are now a part of the National Council of Elders all these years later. And had I not bumped into her when I was 17, I'm now 72, she's older than me, but she's still living at the Highlander Center. So the National Council of Elders, and I'm looking at you, Susan, and others, is around 20th century organizers that are now intentionally working with 21st century organizers and how we do that in a very systematic, proactive way. That gives me a tremendous amount of hope and possibility. And the way you can tell, look at the pushback. When you have all these voter suppressions, we've been there, done that about trying to suppress that vote. But when you get the women's vote, people of color who didn't have the right to vote in the beginning, and you bring that, and then when you think about all of us in this conversation about how we collectivize that, but again, changing of hearts and minds, and the changing of public policy, and where do each of us fit into that in that conversation, personally and institutionally. So count me as a 10 of 10. Yes, it's going to happen.
If I may, Chris, you probably know Greg Daddis, who is a Vietnam scholar. He was a colonel in the Army and was my boss at West Point. And I was put in charge, naturally, given how I look, of the Civil Rights History Division at West Point, which, if you understand the faculty at West Point at the time, made sense. And Greg said to me, true story, in my first interview when I came into his department, he said, "You sound vaguely liberal. You should be in charge of the Civil Rights Division." But the reason I bring that up is to say that I'm a writer and a bit of a historian, which means I'm really good at pointing out problems and not so great at pointing out solutions. But people often ask me, well, what? How do we do this? There is no draft. We live in the world as it is. And I think something that's important is if we're going to have a movement that opposes today's wars, which are obscene and grotesque on a level that is not dissimilar to what was happening in the 1960s and early 70s, we have to make something clear. We have to use the old James Carville, Bill Clinton campaign rule, which is it's the economy, stupid. In other words, war is a kitchen table issue. We've just tried to pretend that it's not. You know, there's no direct war tax, there's no draft, but the reality is that I grew up in the 1980s and 90s when there were slick slogans that the Army contracted out to corporate advertisers. And the one from our generation was "Be all you can be." It was a great commercial. I mean, it sold me. I went to Iraq because of that commercial, frankly. But really, I think that if we were being honest, if I was doing an Onion headline, that's not an Onion headline. It would be the slogan for the Department of Defense should be the DOD. This is why you can't have nice things. And so I think that it is very important to describe to the American people that there are massive trade-offs. There are things we don't get in terms of social safety nets and social justice because of the empire. Because empires in decline behave badly, and they always come home, and there are massive trade-offs. And I'm not pretending to be the person who has the activist background to understand how we implement this, but I do think that until we make it clear as much as possible to the American people that what the empire does overseas is affecting what is possible, permissible, and even imagined at home, then we're going to have a lot of trouble getting a movement together. And I think that probably a lot of people on this panel know more about that and how to do it.
We just have a couple of minutes left. I'd like to if Randy can contribute.
Can you hear me now?
We can.
Yes.
That's because our daughter, who lives 2 blocks away, ran and got her computer because this one we're using doesn't work very well. I just wanted to go back to something I think you were saying, Susan, a minute ago, which is how do we, all of us, find a way to really empathize and feel compassion for and share the sufferings, at least from a distance, of all the people who are suffering both in this country and in the countries that we are obliterating overseas. And I'll say in my case, I was very lucky because I got a head start on that personal evolution because, as I mentioned, I spent 15 months in a refugee camp for Rwandans based on an earlier genocide from the big one everybody's heard about in 95. So I, at age first 19, 20, 21, was with people who had gone through the most horrendous, genocide against them. And they were just trying to pick up the pieces. So when I came back to the United States and realized that I had been in a so-called third world country and that most of the world is a third world country, and then watching the news, which people don't get today, the wartime coverage that would show bombs going off and people suffering, women and crying and so forth. I thought, these are my Rwandan friends, the same people. So it's burst me open in a way that I'm very grateful for. I don't know what it's going to take at this point, but I also like to say that I think we need to broaden the definition of war. We have a war-oriented political system that gives tremendous influence to billionaires who fund political campaigns. We have a war-oriented economy, which, well, we all know how that works to the huge advantage of a tiny minority and the huge disadvantages to people at the bottom. So if there's some way, and I don't know what the magic formula is, to make war a much more inclusive, in-depth concept, because everything we do feeds into the war mentality and the war structures and the war economy, and it's just going to go on until somehow we can wake up that these other things have to happen. And I will just say one thing. I was very fortunate in being able to be one of the founders of what was what has been called the largest disarmament movement in U.S. history, which was the nuclear weapons freeze campaign during the early 80s. And, one of the things that was so discouraging was after the so-called Cold War was over and the Soviet Union had collapsed, we thought there would be a peace dividend, remember? But one of the two different senators, like probably Democrats in Congress, told a friend of mine in the course of 2 days, my friend asking, why isn't there going to be a peace dividend? The Soviet Union's collapsed, the Cold War is over. And the guy said the same thing in both cases. He said, don't look at the opinion polls. Look at where the money comes from. Follow the money. And we have still tolerated a system in which big money is allowed to essentially control politics. And politics controls the military, or often the military runs both ways. But so anyway, that's my 2 bits about that. And I will say that it has Dan Ellsberg's response to my speech in 1969 blew me away. I hadn't, I'm 25 years old. And they asked me to give one of the keynote speeches at the end of this International War Resistance Conference. And so I did, and I was amazed that I never knew it was recorded until Charlie Sennett's assistant came and said, have you heard your speech recently? I said, what? Anyway, it is still available, but it's not a spectacular speech. I'm not the greatest speech maker in the world, but the fact that, and this is a lesson, that the fact that there was a guy in the audience named Ellsberg who cracked up over what I had to say, not because I was saying it, but because the words in what I had done, my actions with the draft, went straight to his troubled conscience. He was already turning against the war. And I often say to young people, and I think I said to your class when I spoke, Chris and Kathy, don't ever assume that anything you do, especially an act of conscience, has no effect. Because I would hear over and over when I would talk in schools and so forth, well, why bother? It's not going to make any difference. And meanwhile, I could get in trouble, or whatever they say. Well, I say, listen to my story about Dan Ellsberg. I didn't know who was in the room. I just did what I had to do. And you never know what the repercussion is going to be and who will be affected. And that's something I just wish people, especially young people, could accept, the fact that you just do it because it's the right thing and it's good for you to do it. So anyway, I'll stop.
Thank you, Randy. Thank you, Randy.
Yes, no doubt. And Whit, I believe you had a question, a follow-up for Randy.
I can't wait to ask Randy this question. No, sorry, I kept mixing Randy and Danny. I kept calling Danny Randy. Okay, Randy. So what years were you in prison? And while you were in prison, did you reflect upon the war, what you did? What were you thinking about while you were in prison? And how were you treated during those years?
I was in, thank you for that question, almost all of 1970 and 71. I had been in jail before for minor demonstrations, but this is a regular federal prison. And for one thing, I often say, I learned more in 2 years in prison than I learned in 4 years at Harvard. And the reason, and it's true, because what a view of society you get from being in prison. Who's there? Why are they there? Who is not there? How are people treated? And it's a whole analogy of, the treatment of prisoners has all kinds of analogic aspects in terms of how government in general treats people. So it was tremendously enlightening, and also realizing that the people there, they were ordinary people who had just gotten caught doing something. And I realized, so many people I know who are white or have money, they've cheated, they've told lies, they've stolen money, they've done all kinds of things, but they haven't gotten caught. So it was tremendously enlightening. But at the same time, all that went on, and I was just learning. The Vietnam War was killing me. I just thought, how can this keep going? And I almost felt at times, I mean, there wasn't a lot of satisfaction I could get out of, well, at least I'm not part of it, because it was still going on. And I thought, what else could I do when I get out? Well, I did rejoin the anti-war movement, but it just ate away at me. And people thought that I had been told, especially by prison guards, the other prisoners are going to hate you, you fucking commie, freak, because they're all pro-war. They weren't. They weren't, especially the people of color who were mostly Mexicans and black people in the prison I was in. They weren't all for war at all. And they were reached out to us, and they were a few of us draft resistors, and there was a certain, their basic attitude was, thank you for saying fuck you to the government. We thought, we don't deserve this much thanks, but so it was,
Thank you.
I'm just,
thanks so much.
I'm ranting now, I'll stop.
No, not at all, but I did want to leave a little time to raise another question. Part of peace work is it's the work of reconciliation and restorative justice and reparation. And I know that Susan has been very involved, and Wayne as well, but I'd like to start with Susan. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your work on Agent Orange. First, just remind us, our audience, what Agent Orange is and how it was used, and what you're working on now.
From 1961 to 1971, the United States started an ecocide program against Vietnam and Southeast Asia, and dropped over 21 million gallons of what we call Agent Orange. It was called Agent Orange because it was maintained in barrels that had an orange stripe around them. This chemical agent also contained dioxin, which is one of the most harmful chemicals known to human beings. This was dropped deliberately in southern and central Vietnam. It was an attempt to force the Vietnamese into these so-called protective hamlets to save them from being sprayed. It had an impact on the food supply, deliberately destroying the food supply of the National Liberation Front and the North Vietnamese military, but it also had a direct impact on the people who were living in those areas. The impact in the late 1960s, 1970, the Vietnamese people had publicity about the impact that was being caused by Agent Orange, Agent Purple, Agent White. And there were questions that were sent to the White House. So there was knowledge on the part of the government and the chemical companies that used these agents, that it had an impact on destroying the food supply, and that babies were being born in Vietnam with terrible disfigurements and birth defects. I kind of knew that because at the time I was working with an organization called Medical Aid to Indochina that was providing medical supplies to the people. I worked in over 31 years in the New York City public hospital systems. And when I retired, I went to Vietnam and saw babies and children in Situ Hospital in Ho Chi Minh City with these terrible birth defects, and started to question what was happening. It was kind of mind-blowing to me that these are the after effects. After the guns stop shooting, you still have 30, 40 years later, the impact of war on the people who the United States has invaded. And I learned a lot more about Agent Orange and Monsanto and Dow Chemical, and got involved with an organization called the Vietnam Association, Agent Orange Association campaign, where we had a legal case that was composed of Vietnamese nationals against the chemical companies that had produced the Agent Orange. and talking about the untold and ongoing suffering. We, as you can imagine, did win that legal case, and we now have legislation in front of the House to be able to take care of those whom we have harmed. For those of us working on the campaign, it is a call to the American people to educate them that this is the long-lasting impact of war, and to say that people are not our enemy, and that we have a responsibility for remediation and reconciliation of those who have been former enemies of this government, and that this is a way to show we need to do this. And Danny, I think about Iraq and Afghanistan. I think this is a way to say to people that the ongoing impact of the United States government intervention and other places of the world causes this impact on people who never picked up a gun, who were babies at the time, and that we have a responsibility to take care of others in the world. And I hope that is some way of bringing an understanding and compassion that this is what war causes, and that we have a responsibility to heal the wounds of war, to get rid of the unexploded ordnance, and to take care of those whom we have.
Thank you so much, Susan, for that. We've only got about 3 minutes, sad to say. I wish we could go on longer. You've been wonderful. So maybe we can just go around to each of you. You don't have much time, but just a brief final thought from each of you. Let's start with Danny and go counterclockwise.
I'll break all precedent and be very quick. My soldiers died. They lost limbs and lives for about $30,000 a year for a war industry that profited from all this. And when you put a hyphen in a word like military-industrial complex, nobody listens to it. But I think that building on what Susan said, this is important. In a democracy, even an ostensible one, what's happening today is done in all of our names. In all of our names. And I try to tell people that, and I can be a bit insufferable. It probably makes me undateable even, but I think it is really important to know that what's happening now is done in all of our names. And so there's a need for a citizen injection of responsibility for it, even if you never pick up a gun. And that stuck with me, Susan, so thank you for that.
Great, thanks. Wayne.
I would say that I remain optimistic. I think the glass is half full. I'm a junkie for news and history, and that might be part of it. And the American people continue to study the Civil War and try to take some lessons from it, and I think apply that. I think that's also going to be true of the Vietnam War, probably the second most divisive issue that faced our nation. But having said that, let me say that we lost the war in Vietnam, and we must acknowledge that. We lost the war in Vietnam, and there were reasons we lost the war in Vietnam, and there were reasons we should have never gone to the war in Vietnam. So keep it plain, keep it simple, and I think as we continue to engage the public, as you and Kathy continue to educate students and future generations, we will have truth, and I appreciate what you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Whit.
Yeah. Oh gosh. All I want to say is this is so inspiring. Thank you so much. I've learned so much, and I'm really inspired by the humanity that I've seen, and I am very encouraged by all this, and I wish to be part of the circle in the future.
Thank you. Yeah, Mandy.
Yeah, I would also say humbled and honored, but I think the two words that really come to mind is resistance and resilience. And by the way, Kathy and Chris, Warrior Sisters League will turn 100 in 2023. Do you want to host it? And Randy Kehler, 54 years, my brother. This is so amazing. We're still here. All right.
Randy, final thought from you, and we'll close.
Well, mostly apologies for my technical difficulties, but this has also been very, very moving to me. At least I could listen to what all of you were saying, and I'm in your admiration, every single one of you. So thank you.
Great. Well, I hope you'll stay tuned the rest of the day. We got a full lineup, so if you're watching, it's not too late to register and see the rest of it. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Kathy. Thanks, Chris. Thank you,
Lovely
everyone.
to see
Thank
all.
you, everybody.
I'd like to remind our audience that we have a website, the Ellsberg Archive Project website, that will contain the video of this presentation, but many other videos and information about Dan Ellsberg's life. That is www.umass.edu/Ellsberg. There also, the GroundTruth Project, which is a collaborator with us on this project, has dropped its second episode of the podcast, The Whistleblower. So please check those out, which you can also find on the Ellsberg Archive Project. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.